Chapter 1. An angel and a succubus walk into a bar. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Angel Bound. Chapter 1. Troubled Minds. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Edited by The Usual Gang of Drunken Perverted Idiots. Author's note: this is a multi-chapter commissioned work taking place a few weeks after Renner's transformation into an archangel in God Rising. Reviews welcome. Re-estais. Climb was drinking. That wasn't uncommon. He enjoyed the occasional beer like most young soldiers. He also liked who he was drinking with. Brain Unglass sat across from him, and a younger man, one of about 13 or so, sat next to Brain. A boy Climb knew as Alden, but about which he knew little more than his name. Climb was usually all business, and enjoying a casual beer was no matter, and his eyes were always clear and attentive. However, not this time. This time his eyes were sullenly downcast and he was not quite sure what to do. Moreover, this was his third beer in 30 minutes. "I'm useless, damn it," he said in a beer-thickened, sullen voice. Brain and Alden drank quietly, neither of them chose to argue the point. They drank in tandem, then wiped their faces on their arms and slammed their mugs down. "Look, I get what you're saying. I sort of get what you're saying. The princess has power now. She doesn't need protecting, but isn't this a good thing?" Brain asked. "Now you don't have to fear for her ever again. Nobody outside of the Sorcerer King and his inner circle is a threat to her. She'll be safe forever, isn't that what you want?" His voice was dubious as he spoke, like he couldn't quite grasp the issue. "Yeah," Alden added, "you can finally do stuff, and nobody can tell her no that'd care enough to say it." Climb stared into his mug. "I guess that is true. But I'm Princess Renner's bodyguard. I've been trained for this and nothing else. It is all I know how to do, and now I can't do anything for her. How can I even deserve to stay at her side, if I am the one that needs protecting?" he asked with frustration as he took another swig from his mug. "If I'm not her. What did you call it?" He looked over to Brain. "Meat shield," he said bluntly as he raised his mug to call for another. "Yeah, her meat shield. What the hell am I anymore?" Climb asked. "You tell me, because I don't know." "Doesn't that mean you get to be whatever you want to be?" Alden slurred out as his eyes started to glaze over. "What?" Climb asked. "Well, ya can't do that one thing, so now ya can try anything." Alden slurred again. Brain shrugged. "Kid's a bit drunk, but he's got a point. Look, all you want is to be by the side of your princess, right? So if you aren't her warrior anymore, be something else." "But what?" Climb said as he finished his mug. His voice sounded lost, even defeated. Brain shrugged again as Alden slumped forward and started snoring at the table. "How would I know? I have only ever held a sword, never held a heart before. All I can tell you is that if one thing isn't working, do something else that makes you valuable. If you don't feel you have anything to offer her as you are, then find something new about yourself and offer that, and if you can't find something new about yourself, then make something new out of yourself. "How do I do that?" Climb asked, dumbfounded at the strange advice coming from his blue-haired mentor. "How did you get to improve with the sword?" Brain asked as the server refilled his mug. He smiled charmingly at the server, a large-breasted redhead that smiled back in turn. She had a freckled face and rolled her hips with every step away, keeping Brain's eyes on her until she disappeared into the back room. Climb kept his gaze away from the tavern girl and down at his now empty mug. He hadn't refilled it. "Hey," Brain said, "quit looking down into the top of that mug like you'll find the answer at the bottom somewhere. You practice, you try something you've never done before, and then you grit all the suck away until you've turned yourself into a master. It shouldn't bother you to do that. You've never had a talent with a sword, and you worked hard at that. So instead try something completely new and apply yourself the same way." Climb actually smiled at that. He didn't look up, but a smile formed. "The truth is, the best thing you can do is just try to make her life a happy one. I've been around you too enough to know you're in love with her, and she loves you. There's nothing in the way now. You can marry her and just make her happy. Make that your skill." Brain said firmly, "Embrace the change, and go embrace her." His voice was almost commanding, and it made Climb sit up and pay attention. "Maybe you're right, Brain." Climb said, "Thank you for the advice." "Anytime." Brain said, I hate to ask this, but could you take Alden up to his room before you go? I've got a new friend to make," he said with a roguish smile flashed in the direction of the nearby red-headed waitress. "Sure thing," Clyme said without further comment, and with a little help from Brain, he got Alden over his shoulder. Carrying him away after that was relatively easy, and by the time he'd come back downstairs after dropping Alden off, Brain was walking towards the stairs with the woman on his arm. Nazarick. Renner was pacing around in her room within the tomb. She'd been given quarters there to work or rest in privacy on the day after her elevation, but until this moment she had not used them. That was not the only first for her. She didn't often pace, she was usually prone to stillness in her moments of thought. She only paced when she was anxious. This was a fairly recent discovery, because until now, Renner did not get anxious. At least not before this. The moment of her joyful reveal of her elevation by the Sorcerer King had been one of the happiest moments of her life up to that point, but in the last few days, it had presented its own problems. Clyme had been overjoyed and proud of her at first, if it were possible, his adoration of his mistress had become even greater. Yet when he realized she had strength, speed, and power far beyond anything he would ever have for himself, he had become morose. He still walked with her everywhere, he still looked at her with those adoring eyes, but she felt certain it was eating at him. Normally she would quietly contemplate matters in her quarters in Riestes, but for absolute privacy from those of her household, there was no better place than the tomb of her master. She thought the matter over, and unthinkingly wandered out the door, following the course of the floor. Instinctively she let her wings pop out behind her and her body glowed an ethereal white, her pupils vanished under a similar glow as the Archangel Renner walked the halls of the god of unlife. She turned matters over and over in her head. It was uncomfortable for her, precisely because she had to think as a normal human might, and a male no less. The former was hard enough, the latter a near mystery. So much did this consume her that she was a dozen paces down the hall of her last absent-minded turn before she saw the guardian overseer. Albedo saw her first, and stopped in the hall until Renner came close. "Renner," she said firmly, and the demoness cut through the Archangel's reverie. "Oh, hello Lady Albedo, forgive my silence, I am preoccupied with something concerning my puppy," Renner said calmly. "Something like that?" Albedo asked thoughtfully. "Walk with me," she said, it was not a request. Renner turned on her heel and fell into step at the left side of the succubus. "What troubles you?" Albedo asked bluntly. It was a very direct question, it allowed the blonde Archangel no room to equivocate or dodge. She lowered her gaze unhappily. "I have several worries, things I do not know entirely how to answer, it requires a way of thinking that I am not familiar with," she replied to her supervisor. "Begin at the beginning then," Albedo said, a bit more patience in her voice. Renner then relayed the events that immediately followed her transformation, and the gradual development of Clyme's unhappiness. "Has he seen you as a woman yet?" Albedo asked. Renner's mouth turned down in a frown. "That is my other problem, I know all about how to do those things with a man, but I have never done them. My puppy has always adored my innocence, even if he was wrong about most of it. To reveal my desire in that way might damage his vision of who I am. If he looks at me without those wonderful, enchanting, adoring eyes, I simply couldn't bear it." Albedo turned a corner and Renner remained beside her, while Albedo walked with arms swinging back and forth in confident strides. Renner in her troubled state, walked with hands folded in front of her, one gently rubbing against the other as if that would wipe the anxiety from her body. Albedo let the silence hang for a while and asked, "Have you considered just seizing him?" "What?" Renner asked, stunned. "You are his mistress, aren't you? You want him, and you even know he wants you, simply order him, take him," she said. "Desire and love are battles not won by the timid, you must be bold and seize what you long for so that there is no doubt of your intent." Renner's white shining eyes could no longer show expression as they once did, not as she walked in the form of an archangel, yet if they could have shown anything, they would have shown disbelief at the suggestion that she undertake such a bold action. Albedo stopped at a large double door. "Come in, have you been in here before?" she asked. Renner shook her head, still at a loss for words. "This is the Nazarick bar, we have everything worth having, and if it isn't worth having, we don't want it but frankly probably have it anyway. The Supreme Ones were very thorough about that subject." she said with obvious pride in their godlike creators. Renner looked around. The tables were plentiful but the occupation was very light. There was a small penguin drinking at the bar itself. Over at another table two of the Pleiades battle maids were sharing a drink from a single oversized cup. She recognized them from pictures she'd seen as Entima in Solution, while over in another corner nearby sat a familiar demoness of golden skin who was reading a book, drinking from a large glass that contained a bright red frozen concoction. None paid any mind to the new entries to the room. Albedo suppressed a smirk. It wasn't that long ago that she'd have taken any opportunity to degrade or frighten the Erinyes just to remind her of her place or to punish her for having dared to offer herself to Lord Ines in the preceding years, and invading their home later. Now however, the two had a more amicable relationship, in no small part since it had long since become obvious to the succubus that she had fallen hard for Demiurge. 2. It helped that the demoness had given her private endorsement to Albedo that she and not the flat-chested lamprey, should be the sorcerer king's first wife and be the first to bear his child. So now when they approached the table, she didn't snap at the demoness and demand her supplication. Instead she said hello to break the silence brought on by her being entranced by whatever she was reading. The response was immediate. Vanessa closed her book and laid it aside. "Lady Albedo, Lady Renner," she said warmly and gestured to the seats at her table. "It's a pleasure to see you today," Vanessa said. Her storm gray eyes did not have the same luster of the wide-eyed Archangel or the artistic flair of the succubus, but they were clear and intelligent and gave away a kind of raw cunning that was constantly being refined. Albedo looked at the book. "Who is Judge Ye?" Albedo asked. Vanessa grinned. "A figure from an ancient country in the first world who was skilled in solving mysteries. I seem to have taken a liking to that sort of thing." Her toothy smile, fang-filled as it was, betrayed ample enthusiasm. "I see, well as long as you're getting your work done the rest of the time." Albedo shrugged dismissively. "Don't care for mysteries, Lady Albedo?" Renner asked. Albedo shook her head. "I prefer to deal with problems straight on and be done with it. Mysteries involve so much extra work for the same result. Oh, to me they are like puzzle boxes, pleasant to tinker with and work through, knowing there is always a solution. It is just a matter of finding it." Renner smiled slightly, the little corners of her mouth turning up at the demoness who sat opposite the two guardians. Vanessa gave a little smile in return. "I see it the same way, though I'll add I rather like the way in which cunning is employed. It reminds me of the way I destroyed Astraca and everything he loved and valued. He never should have touched me." "Never," she said, a hint of anger rising to her face as lightning flashed in storm gray eyes. "You have him now though," Renner reminded her, and Vanessa's eyes lit up. "I do. I wonder when I will be satisfied with him," the demoness said offhandedly. "Perhaps when there is nothing left of the man he was," Albedo offered thoughtfully as a server approached and took their orders. "How do you mean, Lady Albedo?" Vanessa asked, tilting her head to the side in curiosity as she took a sip from her drink. "He was a king, a proud man, a nobleman. He got everything he ever wanted. It is part of why he hated you, because you denied him something he wanted." Albedo explained patiently. "When you have made him into a mere beast, a slavering pathetic chattel who would lick the bottoms of your feet clean after walking through field of cattle that had eaten something they should not have, when he will lick with a smile and thank you for the privilege so that you won't hurt him again, and all his sense of self is thrown away like trash. Then perhaps you'll consider being finished with him," Albedo said, reaching out a moment later to take a glass from the waiter. Renner did the same, and chimed in, "I've never had any real hate like that. There were those I wanted to kill, generally those who were critical of my puppy, anyone who insulted him. They had to die. They had to die." Her voice went cold and distant, and then she snapped back to the present. "But it was a perfunctory kind of thing. They crossed a line and could not go back, so I had them ended, one by one. Putting them on Philip's side so they could be killed easily later, or simply have them assassinated after the fact. I wonder what it is like to feel the same kind of visceral hate of a demon," she questioned idly. "Good," Albedo and Vanessa said in unison, before sharing a mild chuckle. "I would say we both agree, there is an intoxicating component to rage and fury that boils over, driving action and vengeance. I felt it when I was a human too, I just didn't have the power I needed to act on it. Now I do. I feel other things, as I'm sure you do, Lady Albedo." Vanessa inclined her head deferentially to the preening face of the succubus. But you're not here over hatred, are you? Vanessa asked Renner with a bluntness that reminded the golden-haired Archangel of the Guardian Overseer. She made a mental note to find out if that was just a coincidence or if bluntness was a trait of demons or demonesses in general. No, but how did you? Renner began. When it was Lady Albedo who got my attention, normally it should have been the subordinate to interrupt silent obliviousness, but you were so lost in thought she did it herself. Vanessa said in a deadpan voice. As it turned out, archangels could blush, and it turned the soft white glow of her face almost pink when she did so. I apologize for my obliviousness, Lady Albedo. I was very caught up in my reading. Vanessa said humbly as she looked down. I also apologize for making you do what I should have. Renner said, looking down at her feet in embarrassment. It's fine. Albedo rolled her eyes. The Supreme Ones always said that there was no rank in a bar. They were very wise. Vanessa said sagely, and took a long drink from her glass. So why are you really here? The Irenaeus asked. She's troubled about her puppy's affections and general unhappiness. Albedo said, drinks often relax someone, and there is no better place for that than this place here. I see. May I assume you have had some choice advice on that subject, Lady Albedo? Vanessa asked thoughtfully. I told her she should simply seize him. Boldly, she rules him, she can command him, and should do so. Albedo replied confidently. Vanessa had a very small frown on her face as she thought that through. Lady Albedo, may I offer a dissenting opinion? Vanessa asked gently. Proceed. Albedo asked as she began to drink. I take it both of you are virgins. Vanessa said, causing both women to simultaneously choke on and spew their drinks in surprise at what the Fury had said. They coughed it up and pounded their chests in surprise. Vanessa retained her unflappable gaze. I'm right, aren't I? She asked. Lord Ines is the only one for me, so until he calls for me to come to his bed. Albedo trailed off. I had to play the perfect pure princess my whole life, so. Renner then trailed off in turn. Vanessa giggled a little, then shook her head. I'm not judging either of you, everybody starts off a virgin. She said consolingly. I, however, have had probably more experience with men than anyone in the tomb. She paused and a look of hate and anger crossed her face. Not all of it was wanted, but they're all dead now. Regardless, even accounting only for my chosen time in the arms of lovers, I would still know much. To seduce a man who is innocent in the ways and bodies of women is not the same as to seduce one who is full of knowledge and who is comfortable with his desires and the embracing of them. She paused and set her drink aside, then rested her head in her hand as she propped her arm up at the elbow on the table and looked squarely at the wide-eyed Archangel. Your puppy, as you call them, is even more innocent than you. Pounce and seize him, he will wilt with the whirlwind of his thoughts. Command him, even though he may try to obey, his body will fail him and therefore, you. Such a shame would hurt him greatly, and no less yourself. Vanessa warned her in the sage voice of a veteran of the boudoir. What then do I do? Renner asked at a loss. You lead him down the garden path, step by gentle step, you woo him to lust and desire, you open his eyes until he can think of nothing else but you in his arms and he has built the courage up to draw you into them. Then you initiate him into the ways of men and women under the cover of darkness, inch by inch, little by little. You ensure he is as comfortable with his wants as you are. Vanessa said emphatically. How do I do that? Renner asked, exasperated, while Albedo looked on in fascination. Vanessa smiled. It all begins with a touch, she said, and laid a caressing hand onto the Archangel's arm, that was both soft and enticing, and sent a shock through the Archangel that she could not even hope to ignore. Chapter 2. Alcohol and an Archangel. Written by, Atheist Basement Dragon. Angel Bound. Written by, Atheist Basement Dragon. Edited by, the usual gang of drunken perverted idiots. Chapter 2. Nazarick Bar. People did not touch Princess Renner. Her maids sort of did as they aided in dressing her, however it was understood by every one of them that this touch was to be minimal. She was the untouchable beauty, beyond the lot of mortals. Though she did want the touch of her puppy, that was all. For years she had put on the air of the untouchable, fragile innocent, which made people deeply protective of her, and enhanced their unwillingness to touch her, lest she shatter like a fragile glass menagerie. Now that she was more, this was something she expected to continue. Yet the demoness sitting near to hand had casually reached out, and caressed her angelic skin. What was more, she had done it so casually that it was as if she felt it was the most natural thing in the world. Renner's white eyes went a little wider as the electric caress of another's touch shot through her body. Then it was done and the touch was withdrawn. Vanessa folded her arms over one another and looked at her angelic counterpart. Though Vanessa was no guardian, she had earned her status in her own right, and what is more, it had felt good. So the momentary shock and confusion to the untouchable princess who found herself quite touchable after all, gave way to a moment of enjoyment. Like that? Vanessa said, lifting her hand and resting her chin on it. You are a woman, and so have many tools at your disposal too. Flip his switch to the on position. She giggled a little at the body joke. You need only know how to use them. Men are not as complex, their impulses are very much on or off. You want him on but his switch has never really engaged before. She looked over at Albedo. Lady Albedo, may I speak of my time with Lord Ines without upsetting you? Albedo's eyes narrowed, while the white angel eyes of Renner stayed wide as she took everything in. Tread carefully, Vanessa. Because you have served well and are no threat to me, I have forgiven your past indiscretions as the actions of a dedicated ignorant girl, but do not think for a moment I will tolerate it being rubbed in my face. Vanessa swallowed, of course. She then turned to face the white-eyed angel. When attending to our master, I noticed his covert nature. He likes to look. She turned to the guardian overseer. I do not know if you are aware of this, my lady, but I have frequently caught him stealing glances at you. This popped the narrow eyes of Albedo open. He does? She got a hard look all of a sudden. You had better not be flattering me, demoness. Vanessa shook her head confidently. I know because I saw him do the same when I was attending him. It was harder to tell because the red points do not move in the same way as normal human pupils do, or our own for that matter, but as I said, I have much experience with men, and know when their eyes fall on flesh they find fair. The polite ones try not to stare, and those shy will find reason to quickly look away. But them that are born as men, were born to look and cannot help themselves. Vanessa's voice was both playful and professional, though it also bore hints of amusement as she spoke to the two virgins. If you don't believe me, next time you are in the throne room alone with him, pose with yourself bent forward at the waist, make sure he sees you, act innocent, then wait. If he looks away suddenly, then he looked first, caught himself, and tried to hide it. Vanessa gave the clinical instructions with a sage smile on her face and raised her now empty glass to order another. Albedo's eyes went serene as she went through her own memories and recalled countless such incidents, and she let out a sigh of relief. If you are right, then he has felt something for me that is not just the innocent care for the child of a dear friend. The succubus said. This was useful information, and I will not forget that you provided it. She said to the demoness of retribution. Another drink was delivered and the empty one taken away. Vanessa smiled. Happy to help. Now Renner, have you seen Climb do this with you? She searched her memory and gave a tentative nod. A few times, particularly when we were younger, but it is rare. She said, somewhat unhappy at what the demoness had to say to her. Then you must get him to start seeing you more completely as a woman, not just as an angel, not just as the object of his admiration, but as the focus and center of his desire. Vanessa raised a single finger as she paused to take another drink. You have his love. She raised a second finger. You have his respect and admiration. She raised a third finger. What you need, she paused again for dramatic effect, is his lust. If you don't have that, then he could love you forever and never get it up. The Archangel's frown did not disappear. Isn't my beauty enough? Vanessa sighed, most of the time. Yes. Years and years ago, she turned and I hesitantly toward the guardian overseer. I offered myself to the sorcerer king, but he would not so much as touch me intimately. Until I saw Lady Albedo, I thought I was among the most beautiful human females. Though I dislike acknowledging this, as any woman would, she has surpassed me in that by far. Albedo preened and nodded with a confident smile. In that statement she did not even suspect flattery, it was simply a statement of fact. Vanessa let out a sigh, and looked down at her drink. Yet here she sits, as virginal as the first day she terrified me half to death. Albedo glared at her as if she might say something, But Vanessa's next words eased her temper considerably, and that is troublesome. I would very much like to see Ines have an heir for me to play with, and two, even without having begun my native existence here, I agree with all the others in that the sorceress empire needs a proper heir. Albedo then looked no less dejected and down into her own drink, a large white Russian. So to answer your question, Vanessa completed her response to Renner, most of the time it is, but sometimes it is not. Climb is a peasant-born boy, and raised his entire life to see you in a way that makes little room for his own desires, even if you did extract from him a promise of love and marriage. You have to overcome all his internal barriers to lead him to the bedroom. This depresses me, Renner said bluntly. And me, Albedo admitted reluctantly. I'm sorry, Vanessa said sincerely, but there is hope for both of you. In both cases the males you long for are within reach, they know you're there and that you want them. They each have their own obstacles to pleasure and happiness, but these are not unshakable. It can be done. Make your touch innocent, but touch him, let him grow accustomed to it. Once he has grown comfortable, move it further. Think of a bath, you must gradually raise the temperature to allow the body to become accustomed to the heat, or it will burn and you will pull away. Lust and love are much the same, it must grow slowly with some, or they will never get in. Vanessa gave the sage counsel of an older woman of experience, and Renner drank it down. It makes sense what you are saying, but it still upsets me. Her white eyes showed little expression, but she cocked her head slightly and looked over to Albedo, who was raising her glass into the air to call for another. I neglected to ask this before, but do either of you know? Can archangels get drunk? Because I do believe I'm feeling the effects of this. Whatever it is? Renner said with a very slight slur. I was recreated as a demoness, and I can get drunk. Vanessa said thoughtfully, it stands to reason that an archangel could as well. I suppose we could find out. Albedo said, and raised 3 fingers to the bartender. After that, I could use a few more. Fine by me. Vanessa said, and what you're drinking, Renner, is called a watermelon daiquiri. I was going to warn you about not having too many, but. She shrugged, on second thought, we might as well bring them on. Hours later. Of course, there's something to Lady Albedo's words too. Vanessa slurred out. Ich still haben't gotten demi-surge ta bite, she am looking at me, we work together lots, and hesh not a shy one. Show why isn't he pouncin'? Ich swear men can be so damn frustratin'. Vanessa slammed her cup down. The bartender had taken away the glassware and given them cups made out of adamantite to keep further breaks from happening. One of the bar servers was still sweeping up the piles of broken glass, stone, and softer metals their repeating slamming had created. Albedo paused from her repeated calling out of Lord Ines's name as she finished yet another white Russian, and looked over at Vanessa with bleary eyes. Get him away from Nasherik. Shen play ta hish boldnesh. You got your house ta by bach, right? I'll shuggus to Lord Ines that is Shen demi-urge to take shoe furniture shopping on Nazarik's coinch as a reward. Shen yesh can try him. Albedo was very drunk, but it was a testament to her intelligence that even dead drunk, she was a clever and insightful thinker. Vanessa went from brooding to beaming. Thash brilliant lady Shalbedo. If in this works and I have a girl one day, I'm gonna name her after yoush. She gave the guardian a crooked, happy smile, then fell forward, hitting her horns on the table and started to snore drunkenly. Albedo went back to repeating Lord Ines with lustful longing as she looked up in a daze and leaned back in her chair. Renner waited a bit as she watched the two and polished off a few more drinks with less alcohol. Vanessa's horns kept her face off the table, which was probably good if she happened to vomit. Demonic responses to heavy alcohol consumption were unfamiliar territory for the recently minted Archangel. Albedo was awake but rambling, and she wasn't feeling fantastic herself. So she got up quietly and made her way out of the bar to request a teleport back to her room in Riestes. When Renner did eventually leave Nazarik and had made her way back to her quarters in her kingdom's palace in her human state, she found that she had returned to an empty room. She still felt more than a little tipsy from the abundance of alcohol, and so sat down at her little table. She hiccuped a little and kept turning the advice of the other 2 women over and over in her intoxicated mind. She was still in that state and still thinking those things over when she heard a knock at the door. Shenter, she said with an annoyed slur. My lady, Climb said as he came into her room. She instantly knew, even in her heavily intoxicated state, that he had also been drinking. Yet despite the fact that he was at least a little intoxicated, he did not slur his words, only his eyes, which looked at her with adoration, gave him away. They were slightly wider, a little more glassy than someone who had not touched a drop might be. "Come in. Close. The door," Princess Renner said, carefully articulating every word so that she would not slur again. Climb did as she bade him do, and then she put a smile on her face like what she'd seen women of the evening do to entice customers into their establishments, and into their arms. She then raised a hand with her palm upturned, and curled her forefinger towards her, calling him close. Who does not strike, does not hit the mark. She thought to herself, recalling some of Lady Albedo's words before they had consumed more than they should have. Climb obeyed again, drawing close to her. He was so much taller, stronger looking than he was long ago, and yet she knew she could now easily crush him. She could command him to please her, and it would be obeyed. But the words of the more experienced demoness had not been forgotten either, and so she hesitated, and tried to stand. She reached out, and touched his arm, gently pulling herself up, somewhat less gracefully than she had intended, and in her intoxicated state, she fell forward against him, and her small breasts pressed against his body. She was glad that for once he was not in his armor, he could feel her there. He caught her in an embrace. "Yesh. Yesh. Yesh, my puppy. She me show I can hash you," she screamed inside her mind, barely restraining the insane desire she felt swelling within. "Osh, I'm so sorry, Climb," she whispered in a drunken voice that she thought was somewhat dusky. "My princess, are you well? You're acting very strangely," he said, just before she used her Archangel strength and pushed him back, pretending to fall, and landing on top of him. She blushed, and tried to give an apologetic smile. I'm so sorry, Climb. I tried some strange drink in Nazarick. And she touched his chest. "You're not hurt, right?" she asked. But just before he could answer, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she passed out, collapsing on top of Climb. His first thought when her body went limp on top of his was, "Oh, thank the gods. I thought she was going to throw up." That was only his first thought. His second thought, however. She's so soft. So beautiful. Her face was so close to his, she was snoring loudly. But ignoring that, and the copious smell of alcohol, it felt good to lie like this. So he didn't move from the floor. He instead reached his arm over her back, and stroked from the top of her head, down to the base of her spine. Is this what it means to feel happy? He wondered. Could I have this every day? She feels so good. When was the last time I felt her skin? Was it always this soft? Damn it, Climb. Get a hold of yourself. You can't just lay here on the floor of the princess's bedroom, with her drunk, passed out, and on top of you for the next 12 hours. Get up, pick her up, carry her to bed, and tuck her in. He mentally scolded himself and got to work. He started to move. With ease and trepidation he tried to gently, slowly, cautiously, and not a little bit anxiously, disentangle himself by sliding out from under her, lifting her up just a little bit at the shoulders so he could remove himself. He began to have some gradual success, only for an unconscious Renner to grab him at the tunic and yank him back with a firm no. And he found himself underneath her again, and she burrowed her face hard into his chest, nuzzling him like a person might have a dog they allowed to sleep in the bed with them. Twice more he tried to extricate himself, and twice more in the next 2 hours, he failed completely. Each time he thought he would have some success, it was thwarted by the power of an unconscious archangel who seemed, even in a state of very deep slumber, like she did not want to let him go. This feels damn wonderful, but no. Get it together, Climb. You can't do anything here, now, with her. He shouted inside his mind. Help. He thought, you need help. He reached with his free hand into the satchel at his side and fumbled for a message scroll. Such cheap throwaway magic was little used, but he always kept a few on him in case he needed the support of some sort from a superior or came across a situation where he needed a senior's decision. He fumbled with it for a moment and broke the seal open. Brain, I need your help. I'm under Princess Renner right now. Brain's response was quick, Climb could all but see the roguish smile and the thumbs up. Great job, Climb. I didn't think you had it in you to move that fast. But you'll have to figure out how to finish her off without me. I don't think she'd be happy to see me join you too, no matter how big the royal bed is. Climb's mouth fell open and his eyes went wide. Brain had radically misunderstood his pending request, probably on purpose. That isn't the point. That isn't what I need. Get me off. Brain quickly shot back, Climb, I like you, but I prefer women, and you happen to message me while I am on top of one right now. That red-headed vixen from the tavern is very friendly. I'll stop by to hear all about your little misadventure with the princess. May make a great book to put in the back corners of the royal library that polite nobles pretend they don't know exists. But I can't talk now. The connection cut out and Climb's eyes went wide. Okay, your comrade has abandoned you in your hour of need, now what? Now what? Climb thought rapidly, as she snored, her hands began to roam over him. Show warm. She slurred out, and his chest felt wet as she drooled a little out of the corner of her mouth and it soaked through his tunic. All right, Climb, think this through. Who else can you call who can be discreet, who can come to your aid, and who will come to your aid without stopping to pick up a tavern girl? He wondered. Gagrin might help, but she'd never let him hear the end of it. The twins might help for laughs, but they couldn't keep a secret to save their lives, and Locky's might have been concerned for him in general, but not concerned this way, and they were all well beyond helping him now anyway, being far away from the capital. Alden didn't have regular palace access, and even if he were willing and able to help, he was drunk and passed out himself right now. He fumbled in his satchel again, he felt the scroll on his fingertips and grasped at it desperately. There was only one noble figure, the finest man he'd ever met, save perhaps Gazef Stronov. He broke the seal on the scroll and connected to his only hope. Say, boss, please. I need your help. He sent the message as fast as the spell could connect. Are you in danger? Sebas asked urgently. After Climb explained the situation, Sebas responded much less urgently and with some relief in his voice, I see, I'll be there shortly. He then broke the connection, and for several long minutes Climb waited. At last the gate opened, and out stepped the butler of steel. He gingerly picked up the princess, as well as Climb, and carried them to the royal bed, and laid them down in it. Climb began to blush even more cherry red than when Sebas had entered the room and put eyes on him, but after a moment of raw panic when he thought Sebas was going to leave them like this, he took a long pillow out and gradually eased it into his position in Renner's arms, pulling Climb out from her impossible grip with gentle firmness. When he was standing beside the bed and the princess snuggled close against the pillow, muttering, Climb, you're so soft. In her sleep as she writhed against it before Sebas covered her with a blanket, Climb looked over at Sebas and gave him his most grateful expression. Thank you. Climb said, and bowed. I feared I would be trapped that way for hours. Did you? Sebas asked. What? Climb asked in turn. Fear it? Or did you just fear getting caught that way and enjoy it? Sebas asked pointedly. Climb's blush did not diminish. Can I refuse to answer that question? He asked anxiously under the blank stare of the butler of steel. Author's note, well, I hope you enjoyed this one and had a little laugh along the way. I'm having fun with this one. Tomorrow it is on to Blood in the Streets and a Heart for a King. If you enjoy this story, leave reviews, spread the word, or just support the Patreon, patreon.com/godrising, that will turn all these stories into audiobooks and illustrated ebooks and so on. None of which will be sold. I just want to make awesome shit for the best fandom in the goddamn world. That's y'all, by the way. Smile. Chapter 3. Silence Broken. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Angel Bound. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Edited by The Usual Gang of Drunken Perverted Idiots. Chapter 3. Re-Esti's Kingdom, Renner's Quarters. Climb scratched the side of his arm uncomfortably and looked a bit sheepish. That is. Princess Renner. He kept trying to speak, but continued stumbling over his words under the eyes of the butler of steel. Sebas's eyes went soft and he touched Climb's shoulder. Climb knew quite well how monstrously strong that grip could be, and yet it was so measured that it hurt him not at all. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrogate you about your personal business. Sebas's eyes closed and he smiled affectionately at the young knight. You got yourself into quite a spot though, didn't you? He asked. Ah, yes, I did. Climb said uncomfortably. I wonder if she'll remember it? I guess you'll find that out in the morning, Sabas said, and stood by while the gate opened up. Climb was looking down at the princess in some measure of distress, his face twitching and a blush on his cheeks. Sabas turned to look over his shoulder. Why don't you come with me for a while, we can talk. Climb nodded in silent consent, and turned to follow the butler through the gate. He found himself in a well-appointed suite, surrounded by objects and art of incalculable worth. Where is this place? Climb asked in shock. This is where I live. Sabas said in a casual way, it was once the room of my creator, and Lord Ines has given it to me, as Cocytus requested only weapons for himself. I reside here with my wife, who should be coming back any minute now. Why don't you have a seat at the table in the other room, I'll bring you something to drink and we can talk for a while. Sabas suggested, and Climb, still in awe over the luxuriant nature of the room, could only respond by silently gaping at it all as he did what Sabas suggested. As he was about to pass from the living room into a dining area, he paused to stare at a painting. What is that? He asked, mystified. He looked at the scene within the frame. A man and a woman dressed in clothing Climb vaguely recognized as being popular in the far south were painted in an embrace, however where their lips should meet for a kiss, they were blocked. They could not kiss because their faces were wrapped entirely in a thick gray shroud, not together in a single piece, but each covered by their own, rendering them devoid of any identity, and denying them the intimate contact of lovers. He could all but feel their frustration through the masterful work. He drew close, and only by squinting an inch away could he tell that these were brush strokes and not two people plucked from the world itself and trapped on canvas. Sabas came out bearing 2 cups of wine and approached where Climb was standing. He stopped 1 step behind the boy and to his left. That is a painting called The Lovers by a man of the first world, named Renner Magritte. Do you like it? He asked, interested in Climb's opinion. It is. Very beautiful. Climb said, impressed, but also very sad. Oh? Sabas inquired as he moved beyond the painting, into the next room where he set the cups down on opposing sides of the smooth, brown shining table. Yes. Climb said, haunted as he walked past, following Sabas and seating himself across from his host. They clearly desire one another, but they're kept apart, they can't touch, they can't taste, they can't savor the intimacy they're striving for. What's more, they're doing it to themselves. They could easily remove those shrouds that wrap around their heads, but they don't. Perhaps they think they can't, perhaps other things beyond themselves compel them to keep back from the indulgence of their love for one another. Climb looked down at the cup and took it up. Thank you, Sabas. He said genuinely and took a sip. You're welcome. But why don't you tell me more about what you saw there? The butler of steel requested. Well, maybe she's an aristocrat, and he's just a commoner. They want to do things, but they can't, so they hide their faces hoping that we'll hide their wants even from themselves. But perhaps he couldn't hold back anymore and would accept even a kiss he couldn't taste, lips he couldn't feel, as long as he knew they were hers. Perhaps she loved him enough that she kept up the pretense, but let even the most unsatisfying affection come because it was better than none at all. Climb took another drink, deeper this time. Sabas looked at him with penetrating eyes. Are you aware that you described your own circumstances just now? What? Climb asked with disbelief evident in his voice. Yes, almost perfectly. Sabas repeated his assertion in bold, unabashed terms. I am almost as impressed by the accuracy of your description of your own condition, as I am by your lack of awareness of it. He added dryly. Climb was about to object. He raised one finger, opened his mouth as if to make a counterpoint, tried to think of a counterpoint, some distinction that would set him apart from the scene in the painting. Then he closed his mouth, lowered his finger, and looked down in his cup. If you're going to ask where you can get one of those shrouds, my wife might have one you can borrow. Sabas said dryly. What do I do? Climb asked. Sabas, tell me what to do. Sabas quietly drank his wine for a few minutes and then asked, have you considered talking to Brain Ungloss? He might be better suited for this kind of thing than I. Better suited for what kind of thing than you, my love? A feminine voice resounded through the suite as Tuer closed the entry door behind her and followed the sound of her husband's voice. A romantic problem. Sabas said, resting his arms on the table and enfolding the cup within his hands. He gave her a gentle smile as she entered the dining area. "Did you have a pleasant day?" he asked her warmly. "I always do. The Sorcerer King is such a generous, lordly." "Ah, Lord." She began enthusiastically and then ended awkwardly as she tried to accurately describe him without referring to him as a human. Was it your day to tend to him today?" Sebas asked curiously. "No, but he passed me in the hall and he actually spoke to me. He asked if I was well and if there was anything I needed since he had been so busy lately. Not many nobles of any sort ever ask their servants about what they need," she said contentedly and sighed happily. "To serve a good lord and have a good husband, it is the finest life a peasant girl could ever have hoped for, and now I have both," she added sweetly and approached her husband. She tilted his face up by placing two small, dainty fingers under his chin, and as if they had the power to move mountains, she raised them up, and lowered her face to touch her lips affectionately to his own. The moment might have been more passionate, but mindful of their guest, she broke the graceful touch of lips to lips and stood erect once again. "Climb, welcome to our home." She tilted her head and gave a graceful smile to him. Thank you," Climb said with surprise. The interaction between Sebas and his wife had seemed so natural, so unrehearsed. All he could do was stammer out his thanks and then look uncomfortably back down at his half-empty cup. "You look hungry, can I offer you anything?" she asked politely. "I ate earlier, but if it would be rude to refuse, something small, easy, and light," Climb replied, well aware that if he tried to refuse, they would press the matter. "I learned something new recently. The demoness who works with Demiurge taught me about something called finger sandwiches and she taught me a few combinations." She waved behind her dismissively and went to prepare something to eat. "I can hear you just fine from here, so why don't you tell me some more, perhaps I can help," she said in a voice more vocal than Climb had heard from her in the past. Climb relayed the recent events, and spoke of the greater fullness of things that had transpired, going all the way back to his time as a captive of Zeshi Zetsume, then forward to the present. "And now here I am looking for your advice," he said, finishing the story. Tuer laid down a tray with small cut slices of bread that were roughly the length of his fingers. At first he thought that was all they were, but then he realized that it was not one slice, it was two, and there was something in between them. He looked at them doubtfully, then reached for one with a shrug and took a bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth and his eyes went wide. As he chewed, Tuer spoke up, "I don't see the problem." Climb finished his bite, holding the sandwich slice between two fingers. He took another, and when it was gone, he asked the couple, "Well, what if I mess things up? She's still a princess, even if she is an archangel now. I can't hurt her by accident, not physically. But what if I touch her some way she doesn't like? Some way that offends her? What if I'm misunderstanding absolutely everything?" he asked in an anxious voice. Tuer sat and pushed the tray between the two men, and looked at Climb with eyes wiser than he expected. "What you're really asking, Climb, is what if the inevitable happens?" "What?" he asked, looking at her as he went pale as death. "You will mess up, you won't know what to do, and you will make mistakes. You learn from them, and you try your best. You're a toddler taking his first steps, really. You're going to stumble and fall, and do you know what?" she asked with a matronly smile on her face. "What?" Climb asked cautiously. "So will she. She probably has more knowledge than you think, but she's still a sheltered girl who was never allowed to read from the book of love. She doesn't know anything about the way of things between a man and woman, and she stumbled already. Pretty hard too," Tuer said as she reflected on the evening's events. She did?" Climb asked in alarm. Tuer nodded. "You bet she did. She was probably drinking to get up her will, or to give you an opportunity to act so that if it went poorly the alcohol could excuse you both from whatever mistakes you made. But it looks like she overdid things. I wonder how much she had?" the maid mused. "Husband, do you know the alcohol tolerance of an archangel?" she asked curiously. Sebas pondered the question. "Well, I would imagine it is not all that different from demons, and I've seen how much Vanessa can drink, so." "A lot?" Tuer raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Since when do you drink with her?" The sentence was a loaded one and he could feel it. "Sometimes I join her for one or two before returning here after my service for the day is concluded," he said indifferently. She tells me much about human life outside of Nazarick. I see. Tuer said succinctly in a voice that even the inexperienced Climb sensed meant it would be discussed at greater length another time. She turned her attention back to the young knight. My advice to you, go back immediately, prepare something on a tray, a flower, a note, perhaps something to treat hangovers, things like that, and leave it for her to find so that she will not be embarrassed. You protect her from danger, so you also have to protect her from shame. Her tone was gentle, kind, but then as she finished speaking, her eyes went hard as an angry sabas. However, when she's passed out, no matter how beautiful you think she is, no matter how much you think she wants you, or how much she really does, or how much you want her, do not take advantage of her while she's helpless. No groping, no fondling, no. None of the rest, she said sharply. Climb nodded hastily, I would never. Tuer's eyes softened, sorry, I know you wouldn't, you're better than that. It's just. Her eyes watered and she looked over to Sabas. Climb, why don't I have a gate readied for you, you should go see to Princess Renner. Sabas suggested in a voice of confident strength. Climb obediently stood, yes, thank you both. I'd appreciate that. He said hastily and bowed to the couple. As he headed out the main door, he could hear Tuer leaving her chair and quiet cries come from her as she fell into the arms of her husband. The gate was ready as promised, and he spent the next 30 minutes preparing a small sobering-up treat for the princess. He placed the tray on a small table near her bedside. It included a note signed by him saying he hoped she was feeling better after the previous night, a single flower in a vase, and a strip of willow bark that Brain had taught him could be used to alleviate headaches from hangovers when chewed. When that was done, he went outside her room, entered his own chamber, and laid himself down to rest. He was worn out, so worn out that he slept like the dead. That was why he was utterly unaware when she quietly got out of her bed, her white skin aglow and white eyes shining in the dark, and stripped away her clothing. He remained unaware when she went to a drawer and took out several scrolls that she had made ready for this. Moving in the dark was easy for her now, her wings trembled in excitement. She clutched the set of scrolls tightly in one hand and held them at chest level as she looked down at them. You will see me as a woman, my sweet Climb. And when you do, I will make you mine completely, and nobody else will ever have you. Never. Ever. She said softly. The first scroll kept her invisible, the second made her silent, the third quieted all casting. She then walked out of her bedchamber, and opened the door to Climb's quarters. It was a little nothing space, barely suitable for a closet to hold cleaning materials, yet it was all he wanted for himself. I know why. She said as she bent over his sleeping face and whispering words into his ears that he would never hear. Because it keeps you close to me, but you could be so much closer. And you will be. She reached down and touched his face, though she knew the nature of her own mind, even discounting all other things, he was a handsome young man, not the little boy he'd been, any more than she was the little girl that she had been either. She straightened up. Your eyes will start to open tonight, she said hungrily, and she used another scroll. This one heightened his senses, then she used another, a scroll of the incubus, to heighten his libido. Finally, she used a scroll of thirst, to ensure he woke up soon, and would have reason to rise from bed. She then immediately departed and returned to her bedchamber and closed the door, and cancelled the spells that she'd cast on herself. She took a moment to appreciate her naked form and smiled proudly at the reflection of her body that she saw in the mirror. She was the pinnacle of her beauty, perhaps the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, and now she had the irresistible glow of a celestial being. More importantly though, her senses told her when he awoke and left his chamber. She waited patiently. He would be returning soon. When she heard the sound of his footsteps approaching, she gave herself over to her wanton desires, playing her own body as an instrument, imbuing her voice with lust and hunger. She heard his footsteps stop in their tracks as the sound of her want reached him. Only a scant few inches of wood lay between them both and fulfillment of their desires, if he had but the will. She heard the small sound of his hand touching a latch. She let herself experience the bliss of her body's release. Climb. My Climb. She wanted him to know it was he that she wanted, he that she longed for. She let the heaviness of her breathing reach him. She wanted to say those final words. She wanted to so badly, come in. Come in. She wanted to tell him she knew he was there, that she knew he wanted her, that he wanted to make love to her. She wanted to tell him that she wanted him in turn, not with ploys or games, though this teasing enticement had its own private pleasure. What she wanted was beyond the door and there was but one way it would open. She didn't say what she wanted, she could only continue and pretend she didn't know of his presence, and hope that he would give in to the increased libido she'd endowed him with through the magic scroll. Though it felt like she lay that way in her own aching want for hours, she knew it couldn't have been but a scant few minutes. The latch that would have let him swing open the door and reveal his own aching longings was compressed the entire time. Her heart beat faster and faster as the seconds ticked by, until she wanted to cry out in frustration. In the moment she heard the latch raise back up, he had let go of the handle of the door. She heard his hesitant steps, and the closing of his door as he sealed himself off from her, and herself off from him, and each other from what they truly wished. The outer guardian let her entire body relax and she violently pulled the covers over her. She stared into the darkness and put a thumb just past her lips and bit down hard. Damn it. Damn it. Damn it. What went wrong? She wondered, and she was still wondering about that when sleep claimed her body for its own. Author's note: reviews feed me, don't let me starve. Smile. Chapter 4. Awakening. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Angel Bound. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Edited by The Usual Gang of Drunken Perverted Idiots. Chapter 4. Re-Esti's Kingdom. Princess Renner woke up as the sun started shining through the window into her room. She moved her hand over her eyes and moaned. For a moment she was startled when she looked down the length of her body and realized she had fallen asleep naked. Then the memories of the previous evening came flooding back. She rolled over under her sheets and her eyes fell to the table, the flower, the bark. The note. She snatched it up and read it. Clyme had beautiful handwriting, she knew why. He'd spent countless hours grinding away at penmanship so that his written words would not disgrace her, and nobody would mock her for the crudity of her bodyguard. His words were sweet, but they tasted bitter after her failure to entice him beyond his will in the blanket of the night. Perhaps I should have chosen succubus instead of archangel, she said with a groan, then took up the bit of willow bark and started to chew. An archangel's constitution is certainly something, she said to herself as she gnawed at the soft wooden strip. Still, so this is what a hangover feels like? Hopefully it fades quickly, I don't like this. She went on talking to herself and sat up in bed. Clyme was probably already up. For a moment, she pondered how pleasant it would be to simply walk out naked from her chamber and into his. What funny face might he make, with white eyes and white wings, her open arms and her naked flesh laid bare before him? She shook her head and dismissed the thought. It might have made for a pleasant fantasy in the moment, but it was an impossible one for her to carry out, not when she hadn't the courage to even call him into her room when she was writhing in the heat of desire the previous evening, and knew that he heard, and if he had at least that much lust to him, that he perhaps peeked and saw the shadow of her desire dancing against the wall. As the headache began to fade she swung her legs over the side of the bed and got up. She went and briskly pulled the bell ringing for a servant to come. She swung her arms front to back a few times, stretching herself out. Her body felt light as air, and her heart felt a little mischievous. She let her wings pop out from her back and spread them wide, keeping her back to the door. When the maid entered, the woman all but fainted as the body of the Archangel Princess greeted her. Though her brother and Raven now knew, as did Clyme, the knowledge was not widespread yet, which meant she could still have a little fun with it. She turned around and walked naked over to the maid, her pure white eyes and heavenly glow sending the woman into shock. You seem to have fallen, Princess Renner said in her reverberating voice as she reached down. Let me help you up. Are you a goddess? The maid whispered breathlessly from the floor where she moved to prostrate herself. No, only an archangel sent by the unliving God to help guide this country. She said, you are truly blessed, mortal. Her reverberating voice all but vibrated the maid's bones beneath her flesh. Renner turned around, putting her back to the woman. If you insist on prostrating yourself there longer, be my guest, but sooner or later I would appreciate it if you would rise to dress your princess. I have a lot to do today. And if you can't bring yourself to rise, tell me, so I may summon another. The maid stood as swiftly as she could and scurried to obey. Yes, yes. Of course, my lady, my princess. she said and rushed around tearing through dressers and wardrobes for clothing. My lady, where will you be going today? The maid almost shouted with the sheer force of her urgency as she tried to select clothing. To visit God in his home, Renner said dryly. The maid looked at her in new shock. Renner touched her hand to her face and looked down. Damn my mischievousness, she'll be useless to me for a month. The Archangel thought with annoyance. To Nazareth, I'm going to Nazareth. Just pick my finest but most functional. His Majesty does not appreciate his time being wasted, so wearing anything that impedes me will be a burden. She made her command firm, but withdrew her wings and restored her eyes and natural human skin to keep the maid from gawking further. That seemed to speed her up, and a few minutes later a set of clothing had been picked out that radiated a sense of nobility, wealth, and taste. Renner knew this part of the day like she knew how to breathe. Layer upon layer was put over her flesh until she was thoroughly annoyed. She thought back to her early years, when she thought everybody dressed the same way she did, with layer upon layer of clothing, so she just put up with it. Then one day, out of innocent curiosity, she'd peeped at the boy, and been shocked. He was dressed in seconds. From that moment on, putting up with such a long, useless process was enough to drive her mad, yet she endured, because she needed to act the part. Then it hit her. I don't need to act anymore, she thought. Stop, she said firmly. The servant froze stiff. Yes, my lady? She asked nervously, her eyes still open wide as saucers. Forget this one, just grab my riding garment. I will wear that, she said imperiously. But my lady, that would not be seemly, she started to say, then Renner whirled upon her and crossed her arms in front of her chest, her wings wide out and white eyes shining again. I will decide what is seemly. If anyone takes issue with what I choose to wear, if anyone dares gossip about the matter or makes a complaint, tell them to come and address me personally. Her voice reverberated with power and authority, and a small laugh escaped her lips. She touched the woman on her bicep. Do not be afraid, you are not at fault for your ignorance, but know this and do not forget it. The ones in power decide what is proper for themselves. If they are instructed by others as to what is proper, then they are not truly in power. The maid nodded in silent acceptance, then her wings withdrew and her eyes reverted to their vibrant beauty, and the maid gathered the princess's riding clothes. It was unheard of for a royal woman to be out and about in those unless she was going to ride, but the princess made it perfectly clear in that moment, to that maid, that a whole lot of unheard of things were going to be heard of quite a lot in the very near future. Soon Renner was dressed in a forest green shirt and longwood brown pants with tall brown boots, and she sat to allow the maid to brush her hair thoroughly. As it was being brushed, she reached out and rang the bell again. Soon another maid appeared. Go and see Climb, tell him to be ready to leave soon, we are going to Nazareth, she said in a commanding tone that brooked no argument. At once, my lady, she said urgently. Hidden from the view of all others as the maid innocently brushed her hair, a mad smile spread across Renner's face and she thought, it's so nice, not having to play pretend anymore with these fools. Climb made his appearance within the hour. He was quick where her words were concerned, and her face had long since resumed its mask. With him at least, she could be as he saw her to be, his ideal, his perfection, his dream made flesh and reflected back at her in his adoring eyes. Then and only then did she know tranquility and happiness, and she could not, would not, ever let that go. Yes, my Climb, yes. You're mine and only mine. Always look at me, always. Always. And anyone who mocks you, mocks us, looks down their nose at you. I will have their lives. She thought wildly. When the servant finished, she stood, stepped back, and bowed. It is ready, my lady, she said obediently. Renner took up a mirror and looked at it. She'd done a fine job. Very good, but there is at least one more thing to be done, Renner said as Climb stood silently at the ready. She took up a pair of scissors and handed it to the maid. My wings will rip the fabric when they come out, I need you to cut that space in the back. The maid looked stunned. But my lady, I don't know where to cut. Renner sighed. That is fair, I suppose, she said. Look closely, she added, and she allowed her wings to come out just enough to press the fabric out. Now cut around those spots. Though filled with so much anxiety that she bit her tongue to keep her cool, the maid obeyed, pressing her hand down to further the outline. and gingerly cutting a pair of thin oval holes around the point where wings emerged. When she was done, she stepped back, and Renner's wings burst out all the way. I did not feel even a little fabric there, well done. Climb, she said sweetly. I can't see for sure, did she do well? Climb approached, and did something he had not ever done before. As soon as he stood within reach of her, he reached out, and touched that space, enfolding his thumb and pointer finger under the left wing and pressing his palm into her back. It was just 2 fingers touching her skin. But she felt the pressure, felt his skin. She wanted to cry out in ecstasy. His face. Oh, how I wish I could see his face. She thought urgently, then seeing the mirror, she took it up and held it so that she could see behind her. His expression was one of awe and fascination, as if he could not believe what he felt or what he'd done, and then he saw her wide eyes in the mirror and his hand darted back to his side. He bowed immediately. I'm sorry, Princess Renner. Yes, she did a wonderful job. His voice was urgent and awkward, and the princess felt her own gaze soften as she withdrew her wings and restored herself to a human woman. Good, she said calmly and stood up. The whirling gate opened and the maid gawked. You may go, the princess said, popping her wings out. The maid bowed and left. Climb, you may follow, she said, and gingerly she flapped her wings enough to carry her inches from the ground, minding the advice that the lovely golden demoness of vengeance had given her about taking care and learning to fly. She had some trouble with the flying at first, finding herself drifting to the left and to the right, but she didn't mind. Behind her as she floated inches above the stone floor, she could feel Climb's eyes on her, and it felt different somehow than it did the day before. Better, maybe. She couldn't say. She turned the matter over and wondered if desire's fulfillment would end the glow of admiration. She dismissed the thought. She'd have been warned if that were probable. So on she floated, this way and that, letting herself hover somewhat awkwardly with the slow steady flapping of her wings as the eyes of her puppy followed her every motion. As it happened, she passed by the Nazarick bar and paused. Climb, she said as she looked over her shoulder, why don't you stop in there, have something to eat, something to drink, and wait for me to conclude my business here? I know you must be hungry. She smiled her radiant, heavenly smile, and those white eyes seemed to him to gaze into his very soul. As my princess wills it, he said, and stopped to watch her fly away with the beauty and gracelessness of a bird just learning to use its wings. He couldn't stop watching until she was out of sight, and only then did he push the 2 great doors open and enter the magnificent room. Climb was not unfamiliar with bars, taverns, and other such places, but what he found here was on a whole other level of quality. The mushroom-headed man behind the bar was like no one else he'd ever seen. For a moment he found himself openly gawking at the quality of furniture, all of which had a mirror-like shine to it, and the marvelously artistic glassware and the range of bottles that put to shame the pride of human liquor refinement as if it were a child's fumbling. There were a few other people in the large open area, a few beautiful-looking human-like figures that he instantly doubted were human, a trio of elf women who immediately started glaring daggers at him, and a small, pretty-looking purple-haired maid in a well-made uniform, who could easily pass for a human teenage girl, but who he instantly doubted was what she appeared to be. His gawking was drawing the attention of both employees and patrons. He smiled weakly and looked down in embarrassment. He rubbed the back of his head in a sheepish gesture, then walked over to the bar and asked for a beer. Light beer or dark beer? The bartender asked. I didn't know there was more than one kind. Climb said in surprise. Pick one for me? He asked. The bartender reached behind him and took a large mug, one made of glass, again much to Climb's surprise, and watched as it was poured and handed to him in a smoothly professional manner. How much will it be? Climb asked as he reached into his pouch for a few coins. Nothing. Everything is provided here for free as it is a place to relax. There is no need for coins within Nazarick. The bartender replied in a voice that suggested the very notion of accepting payment was offensive. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Climb replied and took his hand from his pouch, picked up the ice-cold mug, and took a tentative swallow. His eyes went wide with surprise. It was rich, full-bodied, and went smoothly over his tongue providing a whirlwind of sensation. The bartender dismissively shrugged and started cleaning a glass nearby. No problem, you're not from here. Though the mushroom man did not have eyes in the usual sense, Climb got the distinct feeling as he took his first swallow, that the bartender was watching him. "You like?" he asked the young warrior. "I do, this is amazing, what is it?" Climb asked. "Something one of the Supreme Ones liked very much, it's called Arrogant Bastard Ale, though why it is called that, nobody knows." The bartender replied with reverence in his voice. "Amazing," Climb said, and went to take a seat at a nearby table. The elf women were still staring at him. He shifted uncomfortably. After his time in Kemi Miyako, he knew damn good and well why they might stare at him the way they did. He turned his face away in shame. "What can I say, that would do any good?" he thought to himself and quietly nursed his beer. The trio were talking among themselves. He had no idea what they were saying, but he was fairly sure it was about him. He briefly ignored their behavior as a mushroom-headed woman approached and held out a menu. Climb took it with a kind of meek discomfort but tried to cover that with an awkward smile. The lack of expression on the waitress did not make things easier on him, but he did his best. "I don't understand what any of these dishes are," he said uncomfortably. "I'll just leave it to you to decide for me, I'm sure you're an expert on this sort of thing anyway," he said as he settled his mind. This, he sensed, pleased the waitress and she sauntered away confidently. When she was gone, he went back to his beer and avoided looking at the elven women. Unfortunately, he was anything but gifted in the art of subtlety and it was readily obvious to them that he was making a point of not looking anywhere near their direction. Because he was being so very good about that, he didn't see that it seemed to anger them more until one of them got up out of the booth in which she sat and came over to where he stood. "Is there a problem, human?" she asked in a scathing voice, standing over his table with her hands on her hips, glaring hatefully at him. Climb looked back over to her, startled, but not upset. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, no, not with you," he said in a sincere, truly sad voice that caught her off guard. But she rallied her anger and poured it out at him. "First you come in and stare at us, then you make a point of not noticing us. My friends and I just wanted to have a drink in peace, we didn't come here to be ogled or made uncomfortable by human filth," she said in a sharp, high-pitched voice. "What are you even doing here?" she snapped out the question. Climb's temper didn't even kindle a little bit. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to stare at you, I just didn't know any elves lived here at all, except, well, for those two young ones. So I was surprised, but then I could see that my noticing you made you uncomfortable, so I tried to avoid looking so I wouldn't make it worse. And it seems that notion backfired. Truly I apologize. As for why I'm here on business with Princess Renner of the Riesti's kingdom. She asked that I relax here until she's finished her work." Climb replied, and took another long drink. His passive, placating tone was having an effect, and also, as he looked at her with something other than lust or malice, she found it easier to accept what he was saying. But still, he was human. "You're here with a princess?" she asked incredulously. "I am. I'm her. Well, I was her bodyguard, responsible for her safety, but that I just don't know anymore," he said and looked down into his mug with a heavy sigh. "Don't know what anymore?" a radiant feminine voice asked, prompting himself and the elf woman to look to its source. The beautiful, stunning, otherworldly Albedo. Climb knew well enough who she was that he did not remain seated, he stood, and bowed deeply. "Lady Albedo," he said formally. When he rose from his bow, she stopped in front of him. "Ah yes, I know who you are. You're that boy who serves the new Outer Guardian." "Why yes, that's correct," Climb stammered out. "Well, be seated," she said to him, a curious expression passing over her eyes as she noticed the elf woman that had been standing over him. "You may rejoin your companions," she said to the elf, and with a swift bow, she did so without another word. Albedo was feeling mischievous, much like she did at the gathering of leaders in the Draconic Kingdom, and she chose to unleash the heady pheromones of her succubi nature against the boy. She watched his body respond in subtle ways as he tried to respond to stimulus he could not detect. She put her head in her hand with her arm up and elbow on the table. "Tell me," she said in her seductive voice, "what is bothering you?" It was not hard to analyze his type. Young, inexperienced, confused, and frankly a little lost, he was helpless against her questioning. Without being able to stop himself, unable to understand just why he was opening up so much to this female he'd never met, he nonetheless answered her in full. Albedo restrained a smirk as her pillow talk skill extracted his secret thoughts and frustrations. When his mouth finally closed, she held a small, beautiful frown on her pursed lips. As a succubus, hesitancy when it came to sex was almost an insult to her, and his hesitation redoubled because it almost felt like he was saying like someone Nazarick had chosen was undesirable to him. It was only the plain fact of his own inexperience caused her to set aside both of those considerations. If you're useless as a bodyguard, you can still be useful with your body. You humans, she laughed lightly, you tie yourselves in knots over something so simple. There is no act more natural than for those who desire one another, to mate. There is nothing wrong with the impulse, you were born to one day do exactly that, yet you take this simple thing, and wrap it up in layer after layer of useless, pointless fears that have no other purpose but to deny yourselves the very things you crave. It's like being hungry and poisoning some of your food just so you'll hesitate to eat. It is so very absurd. She put her hand over her mouth and laughed in amusement as Klein blushed. It isn't that simple. I don't want to. He paused as he searched for a word. Hurt her? Albedo laughed at the very notion. Boy, she is an archangel, believe me when I say that she is not the one who would accidentally get hurt. He shook his head, not that kind of hurt. Klein said with a firm voice. Albedo narrowed her eyes at him. Look at me, boy. She said in a voice which surpassed his own in firm resolve, and he met her golden eyes. I speak from experience when I tell you that as long as you do nothing, the hurt you inflict is worse than any foibles brought about by your ignorance or lack of skill in the act. If you want her and she wants you, and you refrain, you insult her by concealing what you feel within. And below, when she is trying to show you that you should proceed. You deny yourself without reason, and her, and on top of that you will only feed her own insecurity and hesitation. Not only is it a stupid thing to do, but when she offers herself so brazenly, you're wounding her when you reject her offerings. How dare you speak of your love and admiration for her, how dare you speak of your desire for her, and then, knowing it is returned, do nothing. Have you no spine? Are you not a man? Albedo said, lambasting him with harsh words and an equally harsh tone. All Klein could do was take it on the chin. But I don't want to do something incorrectly, I want. He froze as Albedo huffed loudly. You want to be a master swordsman without ever drawing or sheathing your blade? What a presumptuous notion. Albedo said with a mocking laugh that turned him red all over again. She reached into her pocket dimension before his dazed eyes and pulled out a book. I don't normally assist humans with anything. But as Renner has been useful, perhaps this once I can make an exception. She said and tossed the book down in front of Klein. He looked down at it in surprise. Pick it up, don't just look at the cover, boy. Albedo said in annoyance. Kama Sutra? He read. I have no idea what that means. It means, for you, that practice makes perfect and these are some things that the two of you can practice. Quite a lot. I will however, want that book back when you're finished. She added pointedly. He opened the cover and looked at the contents, glad he was already blushing so that he would not do so all over again. Thank you. Klein said, stupefied as to what other response would do in such an unusual set of circumstances as these. Better. You have manners at least. She said, then stood and turned when she heard a male and female voice behind her addressing the bartender. The people I'm meeting are here, I'll be leaving, but you remember what I said to you, boy. She said dismissively, and left to approach a crystal-eyed man in a suit, and a gold-skinned demoness in a short red dress. Lacking anything else to do, Klein got up and moved to a more private, corner booth and started to read and study everything held within the contents of the text. His heart froze in his chest for a moment, so shocked by the blatantly depicted and explained material that he could not believe the boldness of the writer. He cursed his long innocence as the hindrance it was, and forced himself to read and learn what he could. He was so focused on that he did not notice that Renner was standing behind him and looking down over his shoulder until he saw the glowing white skin of her hand, and felt it on his bicep where she touched him. What have you got there? She asked with a little smile, and he immediately snapped the book closed and stood up immediately. Nothing, princess, just something Lady Albedo gave to me, to read. See. He stammered out his explanation as best he could, only for her to shake her head and cut off the need for him to continue speaking. It's fine, I've finished what I came to do here, we're going to be going now. She instructed, "Come with me and they'll open a gate for us." "To your quarters?" Climb asked impulsively. She cocked her head at him and said, "Why yes, is there some problem with that?" Her voice carried a hint of surprise as she answered the question. "No, princess, none at all," Climb replied, as resolve hardened within. Author's note: coming to the climax of this story pretty soon. I have a lot of work to do on my end of the real world, and frankly am eager for my new computer to get here so I won't have to deal with the sluggish response and constant freezing of this current antique. Some days when I finish one chapter, I could have easily finished 3 or 4 if it were not for the constant locking up I've had to deal with. But, new one ordered and it should arrive tomorrow. So, yay! Anyway, always a pleasure. Hope the client is happy with my work and so are the rest of you. Leave a review and let me know your thoughts, and until the next time, have a pleasant day. Smile. Chapter 5. Down the Garden Path. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Angel Bound. Written by Atheist Basement Dragon. Edited by The Usual Gang of Drunken Perverted Idiots. Chapter 5. Re-Estize, Renner's Quarters. When Climb stepped out from beyond the impossible gate that was now as much a banal part of his reality as the turning of the seasons, his first act was to look to the window. The twilight hours were descending upon them as the light of the distant sun began to fade away. He took a deep breath as the princess stepped away from him and over to the cord beside her bed that would have rung for a maid. "Was your time productive, princess?" Climb asked curiously as he watched the fading light of through the window. "It was. I spoke of my brother's reaction to my elevation, and he handled it far better than I expected. I wonder now if I had not always underestimated him. Perhaps I did, after all it was Barbaro to which I always compared him. A mistake on my part," she said, her hand hovering before the cord, but then drew away slowly. She didn't look over at him, and he didn't look over at her. The momentary silence was uncomfortable for them both. "I know it is poor form to speak ill of the dead, my princess, and even treasonous to speak ill of a member of the royal family. But I never liked Prince Barbaro. Many times I wanted to strike him for how he spoke to you. If I may be so bold, the new king is a better man than his brother was," Climb said quietly. "Why didn't you?" she asked as she sat on the edge of her bed. She looked over at his back as Climb kept a vigil on the window as if seeking something. "Because I feared I would be sent away from you. Being a street kid, poor and alone, that I could have lived with, except that I would have missed serving you so much." I did my best to deflect his words, but my failure to demand a duel or to strike him, even if I lost, will always besmirch my memories of his life and your childhood," Climb answered. "Much as it pains me, you made the right choice at the time," she said in her soft, sensitive voice. While within her mind she could scarcely believe what was happening. "He's watching through the window? Why? What is he doing?" "Maybe, but it never felt like the right choice, my princess," Climb replied with a confidence that she seldom saw save when he was preparing for battle. The book he'd brought back with him was clutched tightly in one hand and held at his side. There was little light left, the room was growing darker, the light that filled the room became divided between the light and the darkness was slowly eating up the light. He was supposed to have gone by now, he was supposed to have left the room, he was supposed to leave her alone so that she could call for a maid and get changed for bed. He knew it, she knew it. She, however, was supposed to have sent him out the door. She was supposed to have rung for the maid. If he did not leave, she was supposed to summon a guard and have him removed. Many things were supposed to have happened, but none of them did. "Was that all you spoke of in Nazareth, my lady?" he asked, his voice still seemingly curious, yet beneath his tone lay a hint of general indifference to the answer. "No, we spoke of the future of the orphans, they are still young after all. The late Philip did much to undo what we accomplished, he defunded many, outright closed most, he might have done more, but the courtesan pretended she was aroused by generosity, so he made a public showing of properly funding a few." She rolled her eyes at such a pathetic form of ingratiation and gullibility. "I'll have to thank her, some day," Climb said in passing. The princess unbound her hair, he could see her reflection, ghost-like in the glass of her window. That was the last true chance to leave in the manner he was supposed to have done. A part of him almost gave in, almost turned and walked for the door to leave Renner alone again. That part of him did not win. The shadow of twilight's coming drove away the last of the light, and the line of it crossed his feet and raced away outside. It was not pitch black in the room, chiefly because Renner immediately lit a few candles, and caused shadows to dance along the walls and the floor. "Climb," she said calmly. "Yes, princess?" he asked, still not looking back. "Are you going to go?" she asked hesitantly. "Are you going to order me to go?" he asked anxiously as he forced himself to remain calm, steeling his nerves. "No," she answered gently as she lay the candles around the room. "Then I will stay," he said. "Staring out the window?" she asked in a voice that was almost amused. He blushed, and turned around. "I don't want to stare out the window, I want to stare at you," he said with a sudden fit of boldness. Her eyes went wide at the sudden words that came from the boy far below her station. "Do not move," she said, making her own voice bold in turn. He obeyed. She approached and took up his armored forearm, and she pulled away his gauntlet and threw it to the floor. It hit and clattered loud and hard. She kept her eyes on him as she removed the other. "Are you going to let me do all the work?" she asked with a wry smile on her face. "My princess commanded that I not move," he replied, anxious, but with a similarly warm expression. "Remove your armor," she said, and stepped back to allow him to do so. It was a slow sort of thing. After he set his book aside on the nearby table, armor was not easily removed, but little by little, he was successful, though it was a noisy thing to do. Each piece clattered to the floor, and each was glad of it, as the noise would still the thunderous beating their pounding hearts. He was soon down to nothing but that which was commonly worn beneath armor, a shirt, and long pants. "Remove your shirt," she said after a second of hesitation. He did as she bade him, grabbing it at the base, pulling it over his head, and setting it aside, tossing it over the breastplate. The princess went over to the table and picked up the book. "You accepted this from Lady Albedo?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "You know that she is a succubus, a demoness of sex, don't you?" Renner asked, holding it up. He blushed. "I do, my princess." She smiled winsomely and came close to him. She pulled off her dainty glove and laid her bare hand upon his chest. "Were anyone to have seen you as you are right now, once would have required that you be punished severely, exiled if you were lucky, execution if you were not," she said, fixing her eyes to his, close enough that each could see their face in the other's gaze. "That time is over, however, isn't it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," she replied with a voice of absolute knowledge. "Do you want me to go?" he asked as he stood there, shirtless. "What will you do if I tell you I want you to stay?" she asked, a moment of uncertainty striking through her. He made a bold step towards her, drawing him inches away from her. "I have no idea what I'm doing," he admitted. "I don't know what will make you feel good, or what will offend you, or what might make you want to stop whatever I'm doing, or what might make you want it to go on forever. All I know is that this is the only choice for me, and I'll do whatever it takes, anything it takes, to bring you happiness. I can never keep you safe again, but maybe, just maybe, I can make you happy instead. Yes. My puppy. My climb. My climb. Do it, do it, do it, act. Come on." She thought wildly as he leaned in, cupped her cheeks, and kissed her tenderly on her lips. It was not the kiss of great poets or the finest and most knowledgeable of lovers, but it was his, and it was his first, and so too it was for her. She let herself melt into his arms, and for a long time they were as a single shadow dancing in the light of the candles in her quarters, each one indistinguishable from the other. However, the spark of desire had lit its own fire within each, and the princess stepped away when the kiss broke, and pulled her shirt off over her head and cast it heedlessly aside, baring her breasts to his wanting eyes. "I'd say, I'm up here, but I don't think that would do any good, so instead," she laughed, allowing them to bounce freely, "I'll tell you to stop looking, and start kissing, my climb," she said eagerly, and sucked in a deep breath as his lips sought her nipples, and they became as hard little pebbles under his hungering ministrations. He was rather clumsy about it really, but he was an eager student in the course of desire, and her little cries acted as commands which his tongue obeyed. In this way, as his hungry mouth danced over sensitive flesh, he learned what pleased her, as did she. She wrapped her arms around his head and threw her own back in little mewling cries of pleasure. The very act of drawing breath was to offer her flesh up to his exploration. But there was more, so much more than this that she wanted to do. Still, it was not easy to create the moment necessary to give voice to desire. She had to wait until he halted for a moment so that she could use her breath for something more. "Take off your pants, climb." She gasped out urgently, and he broke from her grip as she released it to permit him to do so. In all the normal hustle and bustle of life, she led the way for the both of them, as she was a princess, and then a guardian. But in this act at least, she felt it right that he be the first to be stripped of all the raiments of civilization. The cloth concealing him came off, and exposed his manhood to her eyes. This was the proof of his desire for her. A lie might come from a man's tongue, or it might come from his hand, but that part of him will always speak the truth. She thought, remembering the words of the Lady Albedo from their evening of drinking. It was only when he stood there, naked before her, allowing her eyes to appraise him for herself, that she too, acted to remove the last clinging bits of cloth that kept her skin from his eyes or his touch. Now that she had followed, it was her turn to lead. She reached both her little delicate-looking hands out, and took his into them. For all their lives, he was a relentless strength. He had pushed himself beyond all reason, grinding himself almost to dust on many days, so that he could barely stand without help, to gain just a little more strength to better protect her. His hands were the proof of this. They were covered with calluses and hard to the touch. By contrast, her own were dainty, soft. They'd never done a thing that could be said to build strength. Yet now, as she took his large hand in hers, she knew she could turn his bones to powder. Her elevation by who she now termed a god of this world, gave her the strength of a divine being and the life of an immortal. She now surpassed this boy in every way but one. She lifted his hand up, and kissed the tops of his worn and battered fingers, and then she turned and walked, leading him to her bed. She threw back the covers and pulled him into it. The power of the risen being whom he loved was undeniable. Yet as he lay over her, looking down into her eyes, all he could think of was how he did not want to hurt this beautiful, delicate girl. She saw his moment of weakness, and she reached down and took his shaft in her hand, and caressed it affectionately. "It's okay, my climb, I've wanted this for a very long time, and I won't be denied it anymore." Her voice was soft, longing, but suddenly went hard as his shaft in her hand. "Nobody will get in the way, nobody will stop this, I will have you, I must." She all but shouted and wrapped her arms around his neck and drew him tight into a fierce and passionate kiss. Their tongues dueled in a battle that neither could ever lose, and though it was still somewhat clumsy compared to those who had much more practice, it was a step up from their last endeavor. They were learning the way of one another's forms, their hands moving over one another's flesh as fingers flew over each other's backs. She released her grip and dug her nails hard into his skin. He sucked in a breath at the sudden pain, but it served only to spur him onward. "Now. Climb. Now." She managed to gasp out as he pushed himself against her sex, and, as she mewed out her desires, her body slowly accepted his girth within. One longing, aching moment at a time as the two became as one flesh, her breath came out at a ragged, heaving pace. Does it hurt you? Shall I stop?" he asked in a tender concern. "And no, don't stop, I've heard it hurts the first time," she said, relaxing her body as best she could and holding his eyes with hers. He felt the slick wetness of her desire easing his steady passage, and followed her will in letting his body sink into hers. He did not stop until there was no more of his flesh to feed to that hungry, wanton little sex, and she wrapped her legs firmly around him, and they began the first, and oldest dance in the book of love. Her newfound strength was difficult to control as she felt herself being driven to climax after climax. If he cared about the bruises she was leaving with the force of her shuddering grip, he didn't show it. All he truly saw and all he truly felt was the pleasure he found in the embrace of the princess his foolish heart had fallen in love with when he was small. Now nothing barred his longing and he could seek after the call of desire. She pulled him down, hard against her breasts, so that they pressed against his chest, and he dove his mouth for her ear, and nibbled at the delicate lobe, whispering words of lust and approval, calling for more of whatever she was doing in every moment. His whispered voice and cries of pain and pleasure when her strength was greater than his ability to bear it, were the same when her ability to inflict pleasure was proved to be of equal measure. Minute by minute, they lost themselves to one another. She guided his touch, and he heeded her guidance, urgently acting to draw out every ounce of happiness from her lips in her cries of release. He remembered something he had seen in the book, and for a moment she felt a near frustrating anger as he withdrew his shaft from within after a single fierce thrust of his hips, but that moment of anger at the denial of her body faded, as he moved his tongue down the length of her skin, through the ample valley of her heaving bosom, over her sensitive belly, until he found that long concealed, often longed for place at the joining of her thighs. He sought the little love bud there, and kissed it, tasted of it, suckled upon it and drew a shaking of ecstasy from her angelic body that she did not know that anyone, mortal or immortal, angel, human, or demon could ever experience. As she screamed out her heedless lust to the four walls, he did not stop, but continued to savor the taste of the girl. Woman. Who he loved above all others, making a mental note to thank Albedo profusely for the book she'd lent to him. He resolved to use some of his money to make a copy of it for mass distribution. But the brief thought was cast aside as the urgency of pleasure took the fore once again. There was no surcease of want, and no hint at all that his warrior stamina was flagging. There were bruises cast about on his body that he was sure would hurt like hell in the morning, and he was fairly sure that she had cracked a few ribs when she had squeezed too tightly with her powerful thighs. But if there was a better way for a man to perish than this, he couldn't think of one. Neither of them realized how loud their cries had been, enough to waken many in the palace, and the guard had gathered, thinking to rush to the aid of the princess. For now, however, they were alone, and when she longed for him within her again, she grabbed his beautiful blonde hair and pulled him forward up her body's length, and taking him in hand once more, she drew him into her, whispering, now my climb. And bucking her hips urgently, setting the pace to which he would move against her, she saw and felt the change in his body as he drew closer to the edge of his own climactic pleasures. Yes. You're mine. Everything you are. Everything within your body, every sensation, every scrap of you is mine. Give me what is mine. She thought wildly, and then she felt it. She felt his entire body tense, from his arms, his back, his legs, and the shaft that had been sheathed within her flesh, and the warm gushing of desire as he fulfilled a long-held-back desire in them both, and as he groaned in ecstasy, he fell, catching himself upon his elbows, and landing in such a way that his lips joined with hers in a kiss that felt as deep as her own impalement. They were still wrapped in one another's arms, and joined body to body, when the door to the princess's room was flung open and soldiers in armor appeared. Climb looked back in alarm as the soldiers spread out to block the entry. But if he felt a sudden shock and fear, the princess felt a sudden rage. Her eyes went wide as she pulled her lover's head close to her as if to protect him. Her white eyes shone with the brightness of a wrathful dawn and her voice reverberated against their very bones. Get out, she commanded. A guard captain seemed about to speak. The guard seemed not to know what to do. She gave the order again. Get out! Get out! Get out! The wrath of a royal was terrible. The wrath of an archangel royal was worse. They withdrew in anxiety and fear. Climb looked down at her as her gaze returned to normal and focused upon him once again. You needn't fear them, my Climb. It is my turn in life, to protect you. You are mine, all mine, 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 and none will take you from me. But I have one question, she said anxiously. He looked at her questioningly, but didn't speak. Can you do all of that again? She said with a ravenously lustful look as naked on her face as her flesh was to the candlelight. I will try, my princess, he said with a smile, then winced. She looked at him with a face of concern. I hurt you, oh my Climb. Before we do it again, go to my drawer and grab a healing potion first. Then after that, if it is so easy for me to hurt you, perhaps you'd let me tie you down first so you don't move the wrong way. She said with a look of hunger in her eyes. As he got up to get the potion he said, if that would please you, my princess. He said in the happy afterglow of desire's first of many fulfillments. He rushed to retrieve the potion so that she would not be kept waiting, because of course who would wish such a fate upon an angel? Yes, down the garden path. Just as the demoness said. Till what looks to be hell is heaven, and he is mine forever. Mine, and I will never let him go. She thought to herself, indulging in a mad smile for one brief moment as his back was to her, and then wiping it away and replacing it with a sly and lustful one that was every inch as real as that which it replaced. Author's note: well, this has been a fun one, as one of the beta readers put it, I set the lemon bar high on this one. I think it turned out pretty well, capturing the mix of innocence, inexperience, desire, love, and insanity. I also had a bit of fun with this, with everyone's advice to climb being some version of, just do her already. I don't take a lot of commissions, the story itself has to be one that appeals to me, and the long unresolved promise between the climb and Renner that was made an enemy mind deserved to be brought to some form of completion. This story, by the way, can be considered canonical to the God Rising story, and in future chapters you'll see them behave like it. And yes, my wife is a very lucky woman. Smile. But in seriousness, sex can be well written, tasteful, without being just plain smutty or crude, and I think I struck that balance well. If you think I did, or didn't, well, let me know in a review, or drop by the Discord, invite in the author description page, to tell me in person. Chapter 6. Epilogue. Written by, Atheist Basement Dragon. Angel Bound. Written by, Atheist Basement Dragon. Edited by, the usual gang of drunken perverted idiots. Chapter 6, Epilogue. Epilogue. The next morning, after untying Climb, Princess Renner dressed and made her way to her brother's room. She was fairly sure she'd still find him asleep, after last night's sudden chaos, and the abject refusal of the guards to go to her quarters again. He had no doubt been very late in finding his rest. He knew what she was, but that knowledge was not widespread just yet. She walked down the long hall in comfortable traveling attire. It was all she had that wasn't a stuffy ordeal to bear with, and that was another thing that was going to change for her. Climb was in the bath getting cleaned up at her insistence because, while you taste wonderful at the time, after a few hours, well, that changes. He'd blushed, but laughed with her in general agreement. She had already bathed herself before she'd let him free, leaving her an hour to herself. Whether she'd need the hour for the conversation she was going to have, that was another matter. She approached the large door to her brother's room. 2 guards stood outside of it. "I'm going to see my brother, open the door and announce me," she said bluntly. The guards were caught by surprise at her commanding tone. Renner's reputation as a demure and patient, quiet princess was the only one she'd ever had. "I'm sorry, my lady, but His Majesty still sleeps," the guard on the left said hesitantly. "I did not ask if my brother slept or not, and I am not making this optional. Open the door and announce me, that is an order. Refuse me a second time, and I will be displeased," she said uncompromisingly. The 2 looked at one another and swallowed, then they opened the doubled doors and stood aside to keep them that way, shouting, "Princess Renner arriving for His Majesty, King Zaynak." Zaynak groaned and raised his head. "Leave us," she said to the guards, who could not close the door fast enough for themselves. Zaynak was unimpressive to look at when awake and fully dressed. He was less impressive to look at when he was half asleep and in his night clothes still. "Good morning, brother, you slept well it seems," she said with a degree of undisguised sarcasm, folding her arms in front of her chest. "No, I didn't, and let's speak frankly, neither did you, sister of mine," he replied and got up out of bed. "No, I did. I was, after all, made very tired by a very enthusiastic warrior with a great deal of stamina," she said bluntly, fixing him with a stare that he'd not known she was capable of a few years ago. "Oh. Yes. Well." He balled up his fists. "You realize you've made a mockery of the royal family, don't you? Cavorting with—" He froze as her wings burst from her back and her eyes went white as death. "Choose your next words with care, brother of mine. Nobody, anywhere, ever, will say a word against my Climb, not ever again, not as long as I live, and I am immortal. I orchestrated the deaths of men and women for insulting him before, when I was powerless. I am not powerless now." Her voice reverberated to his core even though she kept a very calm, tranquil tone. "Your bodyguard," he finished carefully. She smiled sweetly at him. It was terrifying. "You are smarter than our elder brother was, and you may with time be wiser than father, but there are a few things you need to know in the here and now if you want to live long enough to see that happen, King of Riestais," she said formally. "And that is?" he asked with a frown. "First, that the powerful are never mocked. If you can be mocked so openly, you are not particularly powerful. Second, as I told you before, I will not be a pawn for politics. I will not be marrying anyone to cement an alliance or anything else. The old ways are over, the machinations of the nobles are like a sandcastle on the shore, and the tide is coming in to wipe them away as if they never were. Those who do not adapt to the coming changes, will not survive. Twisted as I may be, if I can see you spared, I will. She raised a finger and pointed at him as she said that, then added a warning. But the surest way to see that you do not survive, is to loose your dogs on me. I am going to wear what I wish to wear, lie with my bodyguard whenever I wish, wed him when I wish, and do as I think best, and anybody who thinks poorly of me for it, I will be happy to speak with extensively on the matter, or send them to Nazareth to complain to this world's only God. Do you understand me, brother? Renner asked him sharply. He nodded numbly. Good. Today I'll be commissioning the creation of suitable dress for myself that does not require a bunch of unreliable, untrustworthy maids to put on, and that doesn't keep my movements slow and tedious. I'll be wearing that around the castle. I'll ride when I wish, fly when I wish, say what I wish, when I wish, how I wish, to whom I wish. I will not be disguising my mind to preserve undeserved egos, and I will not be bowing to the wishes of the throne, no matter who sits on it, because there is an authority above the throne now. Eliminate your old way of thinking, Zainak. She said, using his name without his title by intent. The Sorcerer King is being very generous, keeping you on the throne, promising you a luxurious retirement when you are ready to hand it over to a successor, and giving you everything you need to create an everlasting legacy with deep roots, the complete rebuilding of the kingdom, without anyone strong enough to oppose you. And though I am a princess to you, I am an outer guardian under the Sorcerer King. My job will be to ensure your competence in carrying out his orders. And my own. She said bluntly. Zainak rubbed his temple. The way you say that, Renner, makes me think you have some already. I do, the guards who burst into my room. I might forgive them for thinking they were rushing to my rescue at first, but when I ordered them out, they refused the order first. I had to repeat myself, loudly, several times. I want them all punished, severely, for violating my orders. She said angrily, her white eyes could not give the same penetrating look as her old ones, but these had an order of magnitude more power to them anyway. How painfully? He asked in resignation as his shoulders slumped. Painful enough that they don't forget it, but I suppose Climb would ask for mercy, so nothing that marks them permanently. She added with some reluctance. I see, it will be done. He replied. Soon. She said emphatically with her arms folded across her chest again. Yes. He responded. Very soon. She added. Yes. He responded again, uncertainly. Silence hung between them. That means now, brother. She said with some annoyance. Oh. He replied, and ventured to the door to go speak to the guards. Renner smiled as she kept her back to him. She was going to like living in the Re-Estais kingdom from now on. Author's note, and that concludes the story. Hope you liked it, and hope you don't have to burn your computer as a result of any of your contaminants on it that may have resulted from your loss of control. Leave a review if you enjoyed it, and have a great day.